Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Zara Anishanslin, celebrating the release of The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artist who championed the American Revolution. The war that we now call the American Revolution was not only fought in the colonies with muskets and bayonets. On both sides of the Atlantic, artists' arms with paint, canvas, and wax played an integral role in forging revolutionary ideals. This book charts the intertwined lives of three such figures who dared to defy the British monarchy. From London to Boston, from Jamaica to Paris, from Bath to Philadelphia, these largely forgotten patriots boldly risked their reputations and their lives to declare independence. Illuminating a transatlantic and cosmopolitan world of revolutionary fervor, The Painter's Fire reveals an extraordinary cohort whose experiences testify to both the promise and the limits of liberty in the founding era. Zara Anishanslin is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware. She is author of the award-winning Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, and has served as a historical consultant for the Philadelphia Museum of Art as well as Hamilton the Exhibition. She will be in conversation with Kevin Butterfield, a historian of the early United States, who serves as director of the John W. Klug Center, the main center for research and scholarly programs at the Library of Congress. So please join me in welcoming tonight's guests.
Tremendous. Thank you. As you just heard, my name is Kevin Butterfield. I'm here from the Library of Congress, excited to talk about Zara Anishanslin's wonderful new book. I do need to preface this with I'm not here officially representing the Library of Congress, and I'm here in my personal capacity. I may say that again at the end. I'm not sure. But Zara, you and I have known each other for quite some time as historians who study similar things. One of the things that I want to ask you about relates to this throwaway comment I heard a notable, now retired historian named Jack Rakove. He was at Stanford. He was asked some question about politics, and he casually mentioned that he spends most of his day in the 18th century as a way of sort of contextualizing how out of touch he was with this particular political issue, but he had a lot to say about the founding year and whatnot. You also spend a lot of your time in the 18th century, and you have for quite some time. Tell me about what keeps you coming back to the 18th century world.
I appreciate that comment that Jack made because on certain social media accounts, I actually have as my location the 18th century. So I've embraced that idea wholeheartedly. And I think what keeps me coming back to the 18th century is that it is just the best century. I mean, it has everything. It has revolutions. It has wild-eyed idealistic optimism. It has things gone horribly awry. And I think it has a lot of promise for fulfilling the best in the human spirit, whether that's intellectually, politically, artistically. And then the 19th century comes along and ruins a lot of things. That's my personal take. But I do think the 18th century has, everything that makes history so exciting.
It also feels modern and relatable in a way that, say, the 17th century doesn't. And we could go into why I feel that way, but we won't. But do you feel the sort of past as a foreign country kind of thing, when you look at this period, do you feel a connection? Does it feel approachable to you? Does it feel modern and relatable, or does it feel quite distant and foreign?
I think that's one reason that I do love the 18th century too, because I think you're right on the 17th century. The 17th century is much more foreign a place to us. But the 18th century can be almost shockingly modern in many respects. And if you read the letters that people write to one another, the language is more flowery than what we use today commonly. Although I've noticed over time, I've started to write like I live in the 18th century, which is maybe a little off-putting as well. But there are these moments where things are very unfamiliar, like the scene that opens my book is a portrait of a woman who's a wax artist. So Madame Tussaud before Madame Tussaud. It's a portrait of her, and she's modeling the decapitated head of King Charles I on her lap. That, I think, is a little foreign to us as a conceptual art piece. But on the other hand, the way it's being written up about in British newspapers in 1780 when it's on display is that it is a really instructive way to think about constitutional liberties and how we should defend them. And I think that's a very modern idea to think about using art to make political statements. Go to any protest around the world and people will have signs and, puppets and all sorts of things. So I think the 18th century is so appealing in some ways because it is understandable, but it's just strange enough that it's intriguing and a mystery to be unpacked.
So I want to get us into the content of the book. Obviously, I don't want you to spoil too many surprises, but you mentioned Patience Wright, wax sculptor, and if you could just pick a few of the central characters here, give us a brief introduction to who they are. I think it might help give some grounding. Mixed in, I kept stumbling across Phillis Wheatley, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, right? So I kept stumbling across people I know very, very well, or feel that I do. But there are others. Can you introduce us to a few of them?
Yeah, absolutely. So all the familiar figures are here. If you pick up the book and look in the index, you'll find George and Martha Washington, John and Abigail Adams, Phillis Wheatley, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. But they are sort of the side characters in this story, which I think is another interesting thing about the 18th century, that to think that there are histories we can tell in which people like that are the side characters tells us how deeply rich that period of time is for historical investigation. And so the three central figures who I follow around the larger British Empire, but they all have this central node of connection in London during the Revolutionary era, which again is kind of a weird site for American Revolutionary history. But the three central characters are Prince Dimma, who's the first identifiable enslaved portrait painter in North America, who very against all odds goes to London to study with a British painter there. And the reason he goes to London is that John Singleton Copley, who I'm sure is familiar to you all as an 18th century artist, refuses to train a black man. And so Demah has to go to London, where he finds a British, award-winning British artist willing to train him. The thing that's intriguing that Prince Dimah's enslavers probably don't know is that this man is also of African descent. He just looks white, and so his family can pass as white. But so he trains with this man, Robert Edge Pine, in London, and Robert Edge Pine is very pro-American. So much so that after the war's over, he ends up emigrating to the United States, where he opens the first major art museum in Philadelphia and is a sort of thorn in the side of Charles Wilson Peale, who has this tiny museum operating out of his house. And what Robert Edge Pine has is a bespoke-built massive mansion with a second-floor gallery that Robert Morris buys for him. And so one of Charles Wilson Peale's sons, for example, visits this art museum, and he's like, my dad's museum is tiny and horrible compared to this. This is amazing. But most of us today have heard of Charles Wilson Peale, but not Robert Edge Pine. And so all of these people are people who were famous in their own time or well known at various levels and have sort of dropped out of the world of common historical and art historical knowledge. And the third person who's at the center of this is Patience Wright, whom Kevin mentioned, who is this, she's a housewife in New Jersey who's raised under interesting circumstances. Among other things, her family were vegetarian, which was very weird in the 18th century. And she's a sort of ordinary housewife in New Jersey. Her husband dies, and she decides she's going to become a professional wax sculptor. And she opens a museum in New York City. She works alongside her sister, who has a museum in Philadelphia. The museum in New York burns down because, spoiler alert, wax figures are pretty flammable, not least because they're mixed with turpentine to make them pliable when they're created. And so she decides, okay, my museum burned down. I'm going to go start over again in London, which is an amazingly bold thing for an 18th century widow with children to do. So she hops on a ship, goes across to London, sets up this wildly successful wax museum, much like Madame Tussauds. But this is 20 years before Madame Tussauds is in London. And while there, she becomes family friends with Robert Edge Pine. So each of these three people are connected artistically, they're connected geographically, and they're connected socially. And they all happen to be American patriots. When war comes, Prince Dimah self-emancipates from his loyalists and slavers, enlists to fight for the Massachusetts militia. Robert Edge Pine, as I mentioned, emigrates to America out of pro-American patriotism and wants to chronicle the history of the American Revolution. And Patience Wright is an active American spy within the highest aristocratic circles of London. So these women and men of color and mixed race are actively fighting for American patriotism, oftentimes in London. And I think this is a really unfamiliar story to us, but really important to acknowledge that patriotism was cosmopolitan and diverse back in the day.
Let me keep you on that point. When George III, and even though I'm here in my personal capacity, I should mention the Two Georges exhibit at the Library of Congress is a great example and display of materials from both George Washington and George III. And it's up there. It's will be up into 2026, but come now. And when George III declares the colonies to be an open rebellion, right, in August, thank you, 1775. He says, the rebellion hath been much promoted and encouraged, among other things. He says, the rebellion hath been much promoted and encouraged by the traitorous correspondence, counsels, and comfort of diverse wicked and desperate persons within this realm. And he's talking about England. Can you talk to us a bit about the depth and breadth of, you say pro-American sentiment, but there's also quite a bit of, I think, monarchical sentiment that's mixed in here. Tell us a little bit about how deep that is in 1775 in England.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is very deep in 1775 England. And in fact, there is an outpouring of petitions to the king after the Battle of Lexington and Concord saying, this is reprehensible. You should not be treating our American brethren like this. So much so, in fact, that mechanism of accepting petitions from the people is sort of turned off as the war starts. And there is a considerable support for Americans, especially within London, but throughout the United Kingdom. And it is something that is frightening to the government in power and to the monarchy, in part because it's not just about the Americans' grievances. The Americans' point early in the war, as you all undoubtedly know, is that their rights as freeborn subjects of the British Empire are not being upheld. In other words, they're saying the British Constitution is what's being violated here. And it just so happens that Americans are the ones whose rights are being violated. And in 1776, as things heat up, especially once independence is declared, they go so far as to pass a Treason Act in 1777, which is the first Treason Act in English history. Of course, there were many Treason Acts over the hundreds of years that the British monarchy existed. The one before this was for the Jacobites who rebelled in the 1740s in Scotland. But this one was really unusual because it targeted a geographic group of people. It targeted people who engaged in treasonous activity in the colonies that had declared themselves to be the USA, or were pro-American or created havoc on the high seas through piracy, which is a loose way of saying if you're American and sailing on a ship, you can be seized and thrown into jail, which in fact Henry Lawrence, the one-time president of the Continental Congress, was. He was crossing the Atlantic. British ship stopped him. They grab him. He's trying frantically to throw his papers over the side of the ship, and they retrieve them. And he ends up in the Tower of London for the duration of the war. So, but he's just one of the more famous examples. And the thing that made the Treason Act so much a source of anathema to Britons as well as Americans is that it suspends the right of habeas corpus. And no previous Treason Act had ever done that before. And so people who were conservative and sort of pro the king's ministers, as well as some people who were very liberal, the sort of John Wilkes type elements of British politics, said this is really scary because if you get rid of the right of habeas corpus, the right to have a trial, to have why you've been arrested explained to you, for Americans, it can also happen to Britons, and this is not a good thing. So there was support in England for Americans out of genuine support for the American cause, and especially after the Declaration of Independence, we've all gotten goosebumps listening to that opening paragraph, right? It's inspiring if you love liberty and natural rights. But Britons also thought that what England was doing and how it was treating the war was overstepping, both militaristically and politically speaking. So it was a sort of complicated reason why people were pushing back against the monarch and his ministers during the American Revolution in England.
The Prince Dimma that you introduced us to, painter, enslaved. He's living in Boston. He is you mix him into this great network of people, but there's also clearly a capital P patriotism there, as you mentioned, his military service. Tell us about the people who enslaved him, because I found them to be fascinating human beings, particularly a woman named Christian Barnes. I kept getting hung up because Christian sounds such a male name to me, but I was fascinated in particular by her. Could you introduce us to the two Barneses?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. They are such fascinating historical figures and remind us really that people in the past, like people today, are a mix of things, right? There are things to admire about them. There are things to detest about them. And, no one is sort of black and white, good or bad in this story, which I think is also interesting. So Prince Dimma was enslaved by this couple who lived in Marlborough, Massachusetts, which is outside of Boston. And Henry and Christian were their names, and they were merchants. And I say they because while Henry was the one who was the sort of front face as the husband, Christian Barnes operated the shop and, trained the young girls they had as apprentices who helped them with sales and such. And because she was very chatty and one of her best friends lived just far enough away that she had to write her letters, we have a lot of letters of hers that exist at the Library of Congress, actually. And among the things she says are things like, I really want these girls to do well because if 18-year-old girls can succeed in business, it will really show men that women can be just as good as they are. This is, 1771. This is, very, very much similar to the famous Abigail Adams Remember the Ladies letters, right? But so she also goes on to say that she's kind of bored, that she wishes that she weren't a woman and she could do grander things with her life. And so I think that's one of the reasons why she latches on to Prince Dimma. His mother was enslaved by them. She was, like Phillis Wheatley, stolen from Africa as a young girl, brought to Boston, and lived the rest of her life enslaved, with most of her life enslaved under the Henry and Christian Barnes' household. She had a son. We don't know who his father is, but she was very careful to name him Prince Dimma, which is unusual to give an enslaved person a double name like that, because usually it's just a first name, and oftentimes slave owners are the ones to impose it upon enslaved people. But Dimma is a West African name, and it's pretty clear at the end of Prince Dimma's life when he writes a will that it was either his mother's first name in Africa or her surname, because he calls her Daphne Dimma instead of Daphne Barnes. So I think it's fascinating. This woman is holding on to her African heritage despite the system of enslavement. And she is the one who starts putting a bug in Christian's ear about how talented her son is. And wouldn't it be great if they purchased him, pretty sure he was enslaved by her brother, it purchased him and brought him to the household and trained him as an artist. So Christian Barnes thinks this is a fabulous idea. She thinks that Dimma is really talented. They do purchase him. He comes to live in the household, and she sets him up in the corner with her pet projects that other little younger girls are doing, and starts writing to people about how great his art is. And she calls him her Hogarth, after William Hogarth, the artist. And she decides, again, I think with Daphne's influence, that she's going to send him to London to train. And before he lived in the Barnes's household, he was a mariner, and so he's able to work his way across the ship, helping with the sailing of it. But so it's really interesting because although, you could look at the Barneses and say, well, this is amazing that these white enslavers took the time and expense to take this Black enslaved man to train him in London, right? This is very unusual. However, they also are very restrictive about it. And she treats him almost like a pet in a sort of, even though he's a grown man at this point. And as it turns out, they are loyalists. They are staunch loyalists, so much so that during the revolution, before the revolution starts, in the 1770s, Henry Barnes refuses to stop selling British goods, even though most merchants in Massachusetts have signed a non-importation agreement. And so he gets targeted. And among other things, a horse is tarred and feathered to send a message to Henry and Christian Barnes about their loyalist politics. This is the only time an animal, as far as I know, is tarred and feathered in the American Revolution. And as you can imagine, this is a terrifying sight to see this tarred and feathered horse and there was an effigy on his back saying, Henry and Christian Barnes, if you don't, Henry Barnes, if you don't change your ways, you're going to be damned straight to hell. And then they also burned an effigy in front of their house. And eventually Christian is held up at gunpoint inside the house with Daphne, Prince's mom, in there. So this all gets to be too much for them, and they leave Massachusetts in 1775, never to come back, losing all of their property. It's commandeered by the Patriots, given over to the use of Henry Knox and his wife Lucy for a time, which really upsets Christian Barnes because she had been friendly with Lucy Knox before her marriage to Henry. And the portraits that Prince Dimma painted of the couple, which you can see today in the Hingham Historical Society in Massachusetts, are left in the house. And so the Knoxes temporarily take them over. And Christian Barnes tries for the rest of her life to get these portraits back and does not, as far as we can tell. Her portrait is stabbed in the heart by a bayonet when the Patriots take over the house and seize it. And you can see that bayonet gash in the heart to this day. And so thinking about the fact that Prince Dimma went on to make the ultimate statement about patriotism, capital P, by enlisting in the Massachusetts militia, it's really interesting to think of what he must have navigated living with these enslavers who were simultaneously his would-be art patrons and did help him by, enabling him to go to London, but also held completely opposite political views to his own, as well as holding him and his mother in bondage. So it's a fascinating, look at what these multi-layered familial situations and enslaved people living with their enslavers, how complicated those were, especially as things get heated up politically in the American Revolution.
I'm glad you discussed the bayonet stabbing of the portraits, which I want to see in person at this point, and I'm guessing you have. One of the portraits we get, I think probably everyone here can completely understand that. Wax figures are a bit different, and you talked to us a bit about this, but I want to bring maybe a little bit of distance between us and the 18th century in that these were really kind of jarring, lifelike figures for people. I don't want to make them out to be a bunch of rubes who couldn't understand that wax figures were not alive. But when John Adams visited Patience Wright's sister's waxworks in Philadelphia in 1777, he was jarred. I mean, and he talks about them as essentially dead figures who were standing, sitting, and walking, laughing, singing, crying, and weeping, and he was unsettled by it. Bring us into this world where these waxworks were as powerful and as impactful as they were.
Yeah, and so I think it's a great letter by John Adams that you just quoted. And among other things, he said he felt like he was walking through a bunch of corpses because they're very lifelike, but they seem dead. So he found it very unsettling. And his wife, Abigail, when she goes to London after the war, when he's ambassador to Great Britain, they go to Patience Wright's wax museum, and she actually she fesses up that she thought one of the figures was a real person and started to talk to it before she realized that it wasn't. And I think it's not often that Abigail Adams is made out to be, the fool, right? And so she is sort of fooled by this wax figure, which I think is such an interesting departure from how we normally think of Abigail Adams. But I think one of the reasons these wax figures were so compelling or disturbing, depending on your point of view, was that this is pre-photography, right? And so we are so used to being able to seeing realistic images in film, in photographs. And I think if you were in the 18th century, art is art's impressionistic, right? Even the most realistic art in the 18th century, no one was painting photorealism at this point in time, again, because no photography yet. So, but it's an interpretation, and looking at a portrait, it's not a real person, right? But I think the wax figures would have been more like a photograph experience, but 3D. And they were very lifelike. They were, the wax was molded, and so it was, very three-dimensional, like a sculpture would be, but it was painted. So you had flesh tones, you had flushed cheeks, you had pinkened lips, you had, one of the things Patience Wright puts in her wax museum after the Battle of Lexington and Concord is the figure of Indigenous Americans, to make the point that, this is an American space and she does not like what's going on with Britain. And those would have been painted to look like, the sort of stereotyped idea of copper skin that Indigenous people had. And so these things are so lifelike. Patience Wright does a wax figure that still exists, and it's her only full-sized one that still exists. It's in Westminster Abbey, of William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, who's a British politician beloved by Americans for being against the Stamp Act, and then it just sort of continues. He dies after making an impassioned speech on the House of Lords floor, and she makes a wax figure, a full-size wax figure of him that's in the Westminster Abbey, wearing the robes in which he collapsed and died on the floor, which is, interesting. But you can go and see it today, and it's so lifelike. There are little hairs sticking up on the back of his hands. So, you really go and you feel like you're looking at William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham, and this is 250 plus years on. So I think in the 18th century, this was as close as you got to a sort of hyper-realistic, immersive experience. And they were, they also could be like movies before they had movies, because they were often set up as tableau. So biblical tableau, for example. Another thing Patience Wright does is set up a biblical tableau of the story of Esther from the Bible, who saves her people from a wicked king and his even more wicked ministers, through murdering the wicked minister. And you can imagine how this resonates in 1776 London. And so I think that for 18th century people, it would have seemed wild, like the first time you see a movie and you haven't seen a movie before, the first time, people saw a photograph in the 19th century. So that is what I think is, to remember the awe and the real jarring nature of this, as the Adamses both capture so well, I think.
Patience Wright, the waxwork specialist, had daughters who worked in the same space with her. So the whole and a son who painted. The whole family is fascinating. Elkanah Watson, who visited, he's an American who goes on to do interesting things throughout his life. He described, I got this from the middle of your book, where he describes Patience Wright as having deep penetration and sagacity, cloaked by her apparent simplicity of purpose, enabled her to gather many facts and secrets important to dear America, as she referred to her native land, which she dearly loved. He depicts her as being a pretty effective spy. Mm-hmm. Elsewhere in the book, you say she wasn't a great spy. So this is my opportunity to ask you, was she a good spy, or was she at least attempting to be a spy? And tell us a little bit about the espionage element of her life and the people around her.
Yeah, they're fascinating people when you get to the espionage, like 5 questions in, right? So she was very actively a spy during the American Revolution. She wrote to John Dickinson in 1776 that she was eager to help and that he should call upon her for help because, as she put it, women are always useful in grand events. And she made this her sort of mantra. She had become friends with Benjamin Franklin because they both lived in London in the 1770s. And he was completely wowed by her ability to have these realistic portraits. And so he did what he could to further her career. And Ben Franklin's a pretty good friend to have if you live in London, or really anywhere in the 18th century, but especially in London before the war. And so she keeps up a correspondence with him once he goes to France. And a lot of her espionage is directed towards him. And so the reason I say that she's maybe not super effectual is that there are records in the British Library of British government officials. So they're not signed. These are sort of anonymous, I think of them as like the 18th century precursor to MI5. They're writing these letters and they're saying, we found another batch of Mrs. Wright's letters, bound for France. We're going to let them go because some of the information she has is just really, misinformed. And so they might do, that misinformation might do us more good than harm if we let the letters go through to Franklin. But I think that she was more effective with the things she sent to America because she did have all of these highly placed British officials, aristocrats, even royalty coming through her wax museum. She casually mentions at one point, for example, that Lord Dunmore, who's the last colonial governor of Virginia, whom she knew from a time they both overlapped in New York, that he stopped by the wax museum and they had a lovely chat, but he was trying to convince her that, she was on the wrong side of the war, and he didn't convince her. But so if you have people like Lord Dunmore stopping by to chat with you, you're going to gather some helpful information. And in fact, what she did was she wrote it in letters. She molded wax heads of people she met in London, like British historian Catherine Macaulay, Benjamin Franklin, and she would ship the heads across the Atlantic to her sister to put in her wax museum in Philadelphia, which is where John Adams saw these figures. But sometimes she would put letters containing espionage and facts that she'd gleaned about troop movements and likely votes in Parliament, et cetera, in the heads, and then her sister would be able to pass them on to members of the Continental Congress. So it is such an amazing way that these two sisters on the opposite sides of the Atlantic had this really, this spy ring that operated through their wax museums, which is fascinating to think about. And again, I think not how we usually think of, espionage unfolding in the American Revolutionary era, but, they have these really strong networks of connections that keep up throughout the entire war.
I want to ask just two more questions before we go to any questions that you have for Zara on this book. One of them is big, so make it as narrow, your answer as narrow as you'd like, which is I learned a lot here about the way people thought about genius in the 18th century, kind of the nature of genius and what it is. And this is something that's I've always been captivated by this question about how we think about, there's clearly kind of nature versus nurture, but also just, is there such a thing as genius? And to get at this, there's a exchange on the margins of a book between William Blake and Sir Joshua Reynolds, where Blake says, the man who says the genius is not born but taught is a knave. And he clearly believed in sort of deep inborn, sort of felt genius. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about genius in the 18th century. And the reason that I think your book is the best window into this question that I've come across is that it was often on the margins that people would try to understand it, right? Black genius, female genius, and probably others. But talk to me about genius in the 18th century.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm so glad you brought that source up because there are moments where you're researching where you just laugh out loud, and this was one of them. And Sir Joshua Reynolds, the longtime first president of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, big deal artistically speaking. He gives these speeches in front of the Royal Academy every year and then compiles them into a book. And he spends a lot of time talking about genius and how genius needs to be molded, right? So you need to go to places like the Royal Academy and be trained for your genius to really shine. And as you mentioned, he's having none of it in his comments. And he's directly, I think he bought that book so that he could just poke fun at Reynolds in the marginalia, which is great. But so there is this contrasting idea about genius in the 18th century. Is it innate? Is it born? Do you just sort of have it? Or do you have a spark, and then that spark needs to be fanned with training? And so this often does, as Kevin said, revolve around questions of, can people of African descent be geniuses? And there's becomes vicious debate within the 18th century British Atlantic world that drags in people like David Hume and Thomas Jefferson, who, they are both saying Black people cannot be geniuses. It's just not possible. And so there's a famous, Thomas Jefferson, for example, famously says that Phillis Wheatley is not a poet, that, she's religiously inspired and that's about the best he can say about her. But other people think that Phillis Wheatley is a genius, and Prince Dimma fits into this debate and this concept. When he goes to study obviously I said John Singleton Copley refused to train him because he's Black. So even if he thought he was a genius, he wasn't willing to overlook his race to train that genius. But when he goes to London, Henry Barnes, his enslaver, records that Robert Edgepine is willing to train him without pay on account of his genius. And so I think it just depends on the observer. Similarly, Patience Wright is widely acknowledged by people like Benjamin Franklin to be a genius because she makes these wildly realistic wax figures. And I should mention, she's a little bit of an impresario. She's a showwoman. So she makes them, I don't think this is actually how she made them entirely, but when she was performing in front of people, she would mold it under her skirts, and then she would whip it out fully formed as if it was obviously a little bit of sexual innuendo here too. But so people were like, wow, this is amazing. This person from the wilds of America can, who's never had any training. And she passed around the story that she and her sister learned to make wax figures because they molded little dough figures when they were girls in New Jersey. So some of these geniuses like to put forth the idea that they are so naturally brilliant that they don't require training. But this is this massive debate. And Patience Wright herself plays into this. And she says, among other things, that the reason she and her children, because as Kevin mentioned, her son is a Royal Academy trained artist. Her daughters are both wax makers as well. Her daughter Elizabeth goes back and establishes a wax museum in New York after the American Revolution is over. That's very popular. And she says that she and her children are also all geniuses because she didn't eat meat when she was growing up. So, whether it's ideas about race or eating meat. The 18th century people have some really intriguing ideas about whether people can be geniuses or not. And I will say, and this should be the obvious counterpoint, no one ever questions that a white man can be a genius, right? It's just other people and whether they can or cannot.
Last question from me before we go to any questions from you. There's a number of times across this book and across so many books that you read that are dealing with the 18th century or the 19th as well, particularly with less well-documented people, that the record just dries up for you. I'm in this book, I stumbled across a talented black artist named Scipio Moorhead, who you have to say, we just don't know what happened to him after this point. There's a young woman and mother named Juliet who you have to say, we just lose her. Could you tell me and tell us a bit about the historian and the historical record and the search for people and the loss of the record?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that, for a long time in American history, it was about what people collected and what they saved and what they thought was important. And after the Revolution, certainly, all the founders, Jefferson, Adams, et cetera, their stuff is deemed as worthy of saving. And it 100% is. And, I consult all those archives in this book. There's a lot, you will see in the footnotes, there's a lot of foundersarchive.com in here. But it wasn't seen as important to collect the artifacts or the documentation related to someone like an enslaved woman like Daphne. She just wasn't seen as someone whose things you wanted to collect and, take time and money to preserve. And over time that has changed. And the idea of what is collectible and what is worth saving. And in fact, it's interesting that the Library of Congress has these these loyalist papers of Christian Barnes because, those might have also been tossed because she ends up being a loyalist. And so she doesn't fit into this idea of American patriotism. And yet they're there. And so we do have these records. For someone like Juliet, who he referenced, this is another thing about, you have to hate as well as love Christian Barnes. She has 3 people enslaved in her household, Daphne, Prince Dimma, and then this woman, Juliet. Juliet is married. Legally, black people who are enslaved can't be married in 1771, but she's allowed to marry this man called Jack, who's enslaved by one of Christian's good friends nearby. And she, celebrates her, and they have a child, and she lets her give birth in the best bed in the house, and Daphne serves as midwife, and she's very excited about this. But then she gives the baby away because she doesn't want to care for an infant and have the expense of carrying an infant. So Juliet's first baby is sold. Juliet has a second baby, and it's clear from the correspondence that she was probably raped by a white man because the baby, as Christian puts it, does not have the countenance of Jack, his father. But Jack is insistent that he wants to stay with Juliet and raise the child, even though it's not his. And Juliet says, I want to stay with Jack. So Christian Barnes is just like, I can't believe that you had the audacity to get pregnant a second time, which is especially horrifying because she probably was raped, is the context you can read between the lines. And so she not only this time sells Juliet's second baby or gives it away, but she also sells Juliet. And we have no idea what happens to Juliet. She completely disappears from the record. And so as a historian, you have to make these calls sometimes. I mean, that's not very satisfying from a narrative perspective, right? We all want to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But I think it's really important sometimes to point out that we don't always have the ending. And I would rather do justice to Juliet and her babies by mentioning that they existed, even if I can't take you through the full trajectory of their life, than to not bring them into the story at all. So I think you have to make judgments as a historian about, being willing to drop these ultimately maybe unsatisfying tidbits in, but that I think are really revelatory.
Zara, thank you for talking to me. I'm hoping that you can answer questions here. If there's a microphone to my left and to your right, if you want to come up to that, we're ready for you. One thing I'll just ask while people are thinking of a question they might want to bring to the room is this. You mentioned a moment, an idea that you had that if Patience Wright's wax figures of some of our founding figures had survived, we might have benefited from seeing a more human portrayal of these people we always see in marble, and that's really sticking with me. But George Washington is someone I literally picture him in marble, and the idea that these wax figures had more survived than just Pitt. It might have helped us think differently about these people. I don't know. I don't know what to say with it, but
yes,
it's
100%. So Patience Wright, when she died, she had a vision. She wanted to come back to America, and she was, I think, constantly pestering John Adams, who's in London at this point, about helping her to do this. And she actually died in a fall after coming home from visiting John Adams, no doubt to harangue him about this, once again. What she wanted to do was go back to America and make a gallery of wax figures of all the important figures in the American Revolution that would have been put in what is now Independence Hall. So were you to visit Independence Hall today, had she gotten her wish, you would have been able to see life-size Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, the whole pantheon of all of the people that we see in marble. And it would have been fascinating because we know from historical accounts and from the William Pitt statue, she's not glamorizing anyone. She's not, sort of doing 18th century Photoshop on these wax figures. They are kind of warts and hairs and all. So I think I love thinking about this because I'm like, what a world if we could actually go and see a wax museum of the founders at Independence Hall. Imagine how different our concept would be. So, in some ways, this book is about the revolution that never was, in terms of ideas people had for commemorating it that either were destroyed by fire or didn't come into existence. But I think, again, thinking about what they hoped to do also tells us, the ideas that people have about the revolution. Sometimes I think it's just as important to look at what didn't happen as what did, and what was sort of circulating, in terms of ideas about what the United States should be and how art should celebrate its politics. And I think that would have given us a very different flavor of the founding era than, say, the Capitol Rotunda pictures do.
We have our first question.
Hi. I have two questions related to Kevin's question about sort of the historian's role in all of this. The first one, you did mention that there is a surviving William Pitt wax figure, but I'm curious about what happens to all the other ones. Like, do they get thrown away, or did some of them melted when her first museum burned? So I'm curious about sort of what happens to those as objects over time. And my other question related is, I hate doing research about espionage because the whole point was to hide it. And it's so frustrating to try to find, how did you conduct your espionage, and where are those letters now? Or are they coded? Am I going to have to decode this thing? I mean, I don't like touching espionage with a 10-foot pole when I'm writing. So I'm curious about how you approached trying to dig into that part of Patience Wright's story.
Okay, I'll start with that one first. And it's so nice to see you, Bryn. So yes, espionage, it's kind of like trying to research smuggling, right? The whole point is to not leave a trail. So it's sort of a historian's enemy. But we do have these letters that I mentioned where, we know that she's being tracked by the 18th century MI5. And she's very blatant about it. She writes to people like John Dickinson and Benjamin Franklin and says that she's gathering intelligence. And I think part of it is to really she wants to remind these men that she's important. She wants to be a player in the American Revolution. And so we have evidence that she's doing this. What we don't have, as you point out, is the espionage itself. So, but again, she's not very cautious. Sometimes she writes about, various troop movements that she thinks are going to happen, and she sends them in letters across the Atlantic. We don't have the letters that she sent to her sister, but what we do have is a letter from her sister after Patience Wright died, and she's writing to the Pennsylvania State Legislature and to Benjamin Franklin, asking if they can put aside a plot of land for Patience Wright's body to be buried in. Because she says, my sister really wanted to come back to the United States. She did so much to help create this country. And she specifically references her espionage acts. And she's like, John Adams and all these other men know exactly how important she was to this revolution. So we don't know what she sent precisely, but we can infer through the letters that do survive that it was troop movements, ideas about legislation that was passing in Parliament. She's really off on the troop movements. She's pretty good with the legislation. And I think it's because she talked to all these people in London. So yes, a challenge. But again, challenge accepted. You got to try to you're not going to not talk about the spy when there's a spy in your book. But in terms of what happened to the art, so as you might have guessed from the fire in New York City, things made of wax, turpentine, and then of course they're wearing clothes. So wax, turpentine, cloth. The bodies are actually usually wooden figures, padded out, cardboard. This is, a recipe for flammable disaster. And that is in fact what happened to a lot of her things. Interestingly enough, her daughter Elizabeth, when she starts the Wax Museum in New York after the war, which is hugely popular, travels around the country, in fact. So people in Georgia, for example, see these wax figures. That ends up bought by this guy called Daniel Bowen, who's sort of like a P.T. Barnum of the early republic. And he also, interestingly, buys Robert Edge Pine's art museum after he dies in the 1780s in Philadelphia. So what you have is Robert Edge Pine's museum married to the Wright Women's Wax Museum, and it operates first in Philadelphia and then in Boston. And then there's a fire in Boston, and it all goes up in flames together, which is astounding. And I do suspect, though, that Prince Dimma, there's more Prince Dimma's work floating around because we have archival references to a number of things he painted. And in fact, I just saw something the other day that I think is a Prince Dimma, but I want to see it in person before I decide. But so I think his stuff might still be rattling around, is just unattributed.
Other questions? I think we have one coming.
Okay, thank you. It was a very fascinating presentation. And my question, I guess, is looking for the end and a beginning, middle, and end part of your story. And I don't remember the name of the enslaved painter who went to work with, went to London to study under Robert Pine, is that right?
Prince Dimma is his name, yes.
Prince Dimma. It seems that he was probably a pretty good artist, at least in some sense, before he even went. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to this trouble. Is it clear to you how much his art changed as a result of his time with Pine? And is that something you can see before and after? Is there anything available to see that effect, I guess, of the formal training?
Yes, it is a good question. So after he trained in London, he did come back to Boston and set up shop as a professional painter. So he takes out a number of newspaper advertisements and says that, he's been trained by one of the best masters in London, and he's here now to take your portrait in Boston out of John McLean's watch shop on King Street. What's interesting about this is he's operating as a professional painter just down the block from where Phillis Wheatley's living with her enslavers. So I love thinking about this, the fact that there are not one but two Black enslaved geniuses operating, in their creative power within shouting distance of one another in Boston. And so I think it's a good reminder that these are exceptional people, but they're not unique. And we should stop thinking about them as sort of one-offs. But so what I do know about his, I know that he was selling, a lot of it, as I mentioned, is still archival. So I know that he painted the portrait of the son of a local man who held people in bondage, but also educated them. So kind of an interesting, sort of like the Wheatleys did with Phillis. He, before he went, was mostly doing copies, and he was doing a lot of copies of Copleys. And so what you can see when he comes back from London, and there's a portrait of his that's on display at the Met in the American wing of a Scottish-born merchant in Boston. And what you can see is when he comes back, he's no longer doing copies. So he's doing his own stuff. And so the copies actually look a little more technically precise because it's easier to copy something than it is to look at a 3D person and make them into a two-dimensional likeness. But what I notice about his, there are only 3 paintings that we know are his that survive. The third one, which is the one he did when he came back, it has it's got so much interesting stuff happening in it. The man has this really compelling gaze, and it looks very folk art-like, but it's just beautifully done and has lots of details like books behind him, and there are titles on the spines of the books, and he's wearing this elaborately flowered chintz dressing gown, and he's wearing a brooch that's made of, shaped like a heart and made of garnets. Mm-hmm. And the reason I think that this portrait resonated with him and his family is that they kept the portrait and the brooch together. This portrait is signed by Prince Demah, so they knew exactly who painted it. And it descends in the family until it was passed on to the Metropolitan Museum of Art both of those things together, which tells me that even though he's not technically as good as a Copley, for example, he was good enough for people to want to cherish this portrait and keep it and the brooch in the family for centuries. So you absolutely see that he's come into his own as an artist who's willing and able to make his own portraits instead of just copies, which I think is the big crucial artistic difference.
I was imagining that his art before the London trip was kind of more primitive, but it sounds like that's not necessarily the case, that he was presumably copying stuff that's more three-dimensional or whatever.
Yeah, we know that he copied, as I said, a number of Copley portraits, and we also know he did a self-portrait that's been lost. So there, like I said, this is tantalizing because these might be out here and, might be discovered at some point, which would be very cool.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, definitely London had an enormous impact on his life and his training.
Well, without seeing someone walking to the microphone, here it comes. Okay, great. I will take this question.
Thank you. So I've been thinking so much about these people and wondering how much have you found the outliers? I mean, you found these sort of wacky people, and they're the exceptional. You said that they're exceptional but not unique. Or how much are they just the people for whom you can find some evidence, but they're representative of this whole world we just have lost? And I don't know how much of a sense you have of that, but it is so tantalizing. I think that's such a great word to think about, the richness of people beyond the figures we're also familiar with.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Becky. And I think that I'll give a quick example from the perspective of Black artists, and then I'll give a quick example from the perspective of women. So, as I mentioned, we know that within Scipio Moorhead, whom Kevin mentioned, we also know was a talented enslaved artist. He, like Juliet, disappears from the historical record. He is sold after his enslavers die to pay off debts, and he just completely disappears. But he evidently was a super talented painter, so much so that a lot of people think that, for years, have thought that he painted the portrait of Phillis Wheatley that's the engraving on the frontispiece of her book of poems. I actually think that was Prince Demah, but we could get into that if you want to at some point. But so think about the fact you have Scipio Moorhead, Phillis Wheatley, and Prince Demah. Scipio Moorhead also lived, within shouting distance. So these are just three people we know about. And so how many other people don't we know about who are part of this story? There are lots and lots of Black creative people in London, both intellectual as well as artistic, musical. And for women, we know that everywhere there's a story about a man, there's usually a woman that's part of that too. And in the case of Robert Edge Pine, for example, we know that his wife also was a portrait painter. None of her work survived that we know about. He had 5 daughters, one of whom had some sort of debilitating illness, so she didn't do anything. But 2 of the girls, for sure, were artists themselves. And after the American Revolution, they moved with their father to America, where they would do something very unusual. He would paint the heads. So he would go around, he was trying to get a portrait of every founding father that he could. So he would go to, take the portrait of Robert Morris, and he would just paint the head. And then he would bring the head back, they would paste it onto another canvas, and his daughters would finish the figure and the rest of it. After the war, we know that these daughters went back to England, and 2 of them exhibited in the Royal Academy of London's annual art exhibitions. So this is just one family, and we know that the wife and the daughters are exhibiting, but their names are even more lost, and their art is even more lost to time than his is. And this, again, is not a unique story, right? So Patience Wright, her sister, Patience Wright's daughters are both working with her. Patience Wright's one daughter ends up marrying a British artist who's rumored to be the illegitimate son of King George III. I mean, these people are just, you couldn't make up better stories. But she also helps her mother in the Wax Museum, and she's a sort of muse for Benjamin West. So you could pick one of these famous male artists of the time period, and you'll find a woman in the story. And their stories just haven't been told as much. So I do think, maybe they're not all worthy of being termed geniuses, but they are omnipresent. And so that's why I said exceptional but not unique, right? So thank you for allowing me to bring those other people into the story.
Well, you'll be here. Thank you for the book. Thank you for the conversation. You'll be here to sign books just after. And please join me in thanking Zara Anishanslin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so great to talk with people about the book. And thank you, Kevin. Those were fantastic questions. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.